Good.
We are good.
All right, I call the meeting to order. And pass it over to Heather.
All right, and we'll share our meeting protocols and give 1 second. I have to do a little bit of screen switching around because the last couple of times we've had some issues with Zoom sharing the right screen. Great. And now freezing on me. There we go. Carolyn, can you see my screen yet?
No.
Not now.
Yes, it's starting now.
All right, perfect. Thank you. All right, welcome everyone to the May Environmental Advisory Board meeting. Excuse me. Let's take a minute to review our meeting protocols. The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and board members, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. For more information about this vision and the community engagement process, please visit the website seen on your screen and the Boulder Revised Code Section 16B. The city will enforce the rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code Section 16B, including participants are required to sign up to speak using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. No attendee shall disrupt, disturb, or otherwise impede the orderly conduct of any board meeting in a manner that obstructs business of the meeting. This also includes failing to obey any lawful order of the presiding officer to leave the physical or virtual meeting room or refrain from addressing the board. Slides catch up for just a second. There we go. Only one person at a time may speak during open comment unless an accommodation like an interpreter is required. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. Obscenity, other epithets based on race, gender, or religion, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the meeting will not be tolerated. Because we do not have registration for open and public comment tonight, you can indicate you would like to participate by using the raise hand function. The raise hand button is in the participant box, which can be found in the menu by hovering over the top or the bottom of your screen and then clicking on the participant icon. When the box opens, you will see the raise hand button at the bottom. By clicking that button, you can indicate you would like to participate in open or public comment. If you've joined us by phone, you can press *9 to raise your hand.
Approve the minutes, motion to approve the minutes from April.
Second.
And then do we have any guests?
No, I do not.
Do you want to kick us off?
So are you ready to move on to the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Apologies for not being there with you in person. I'm getting over a bug and decided not to share if I have a coughing fit, but also apologies, I may cough during the presentation, so please bear with me. For those I haven't met, I'm Carol Neelam. I'm a senior manager in the Climate Initiatives Department for the city. I manage our energy systems work as well as I'm the partnership manager for our partnership with Xcel Energy. So happy to talk to you this evening about our council priority project for this year, which is on power reliability and resilience. So I'm just going to pull up my slides here if you give me a second. And just verifying you can see the slide okay? Perfect, great.
Yes.
Thanks. So I think everybody pretty well understands why we're here and why council took this important issue up. Obviously, our lived experiences over the last couple of years have really changed with declining power reliability, proactive shutoff by our utility, and the impacts it has, and they're widespread. We've certainly seen very significant disruption in city services, including uh, outages impacting our water treatment and our wastewater treatment plants, street lights, traffic signals, our city facilities. It's been tremendously disruptive to the businesses that have been impacted by the outages. We've had large outages impacting significant portions of the community, and then, of course, on our residents who have experienced the trauma of long outages, loss of food, loss of access to important medical equipment, right? So the council took this issue up at their retreat, noting that our work didn't start in January with council adopting this. We've been working on this issue for some time in our work at the city and our work with Xcel, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So just a quick background on where the concerns are, what they're stemming from. Our work we're planning for this year for 2026 is part of the council priority. Talk a little bit about our community engagement approach that's part of that council process. Share with you some progress so far, and then talk about the next steps. So I thought it's helpful to really understand a little bit more about the electric system serving Boulder. It's a very complex spider web of different lines. The image on the right that you're seeing are each color represents an individual power line starting out from one of our 6 substations serving within the community, and then a subset of those you'll see pass from inside the city to outside, or vice versa, from outside the city inside. And when we talk about some of the wildfire safety concerns in particular, those lines that serve both inside and outside of the city are really important. And I'll highlight them here with some of the circles on the screen just to draw a little bit more attention. There's over 30 individual lines that serve within the city. And as you can see where the colors come close together, you can have individual, blocks or neighbors served from completely different power lines and having a very different lived experience in terms of power reliability. And this leads to a lot of the confusion and some of the challenges the community has had in understanding the outages and how they've been impacting them and why. There are multiple sources of declining reliability that we're seeing, especially over the last 2 years. They're certainly the most impactful, which is Xcel's use of public safety power shutoffs or wildfire safety settings that I'll talk about in more detail. We've also seen more damage to lines during extreme weather from extreme winds. We have aging equipment, so we have end-of-life failures that are occurring throughout the community just based on when we built out the community. We also have people that have experienced outages due to cars running into power lines or construction, as well as work Xcel is doing to upgrade the system, causing known outages or planned construction. So for example, the map on the right is just showing you frequency of outages. So the more red you see in terms of those dots, the more frequent outages that area of town has experienced. And the one I've circled has actually had outages for all 5 of the reasons that I have highlighted here. So there's no single silver bullet. People are experiencing outages for different reasons, which is contributing to some of the challenges we face as we try and remedy it. A lot of folks ask us about, why now? Why is Xcel shutting off power? What's changed? It's always been windy in Boulder. People who follow wind data will say actually wind speeds are declining. But as you are our Environmental Advisory Board, you certainly understand that our climate has changed dramatically. Our windiest days are historically during winter, and historically we used to have more moisture on the ground. So when a power pole came down, which they most certainly did, there was far less likely opportunity for there to be ignition. The image on the right was taken in December. That's really what we're seeing in many of our winters and during some of our windiest months. And we've learned what can happen when a power line comes down in high-speed winds during drought conditions. And here are just some examples of some of the most impactful fires we've seen in the last decade across the country, from the Camp Fire that destroyed multiple communities in California, including Paradise, to the 2024 Panhandle Fire, which was the most destructive in Texas history, to Lahaina, which destroyed over 2,000 buildings, most of the downtown area, took over 100 lives, and most recently the Eaton Fire, which was also caused by a power equipment in high winds. So how is Xcel approaching this wildfire risk and the learnings from some of those recent fires? As we all know, they're shutting off power proactively. I've listed the criteria here so we can understand when it's happening. It's during the top 1% of wind speeds, when there's also very low humidity and a large amount of fuel on the ground. So these are the 99th percentile events, but we are seeing more of these historical wind events, not just speed, but some of the shear forces that we're seeing from just the directional forces of the wind. They're also using enhanced power safety settings. They are not alone. All of our utilities are actually using these enhanced power safety settings. So on red flag warning days, the system is set so that it doesn't just keep trying to restore power. It immediately shuts off until it can be inspected. But in parallel, they're trying to fix the system so these tools become less necessary. Hardening the infrastructure, using better wildfire standards that didn't exist 50, 70 years ago when these systems were originally constructed in our area. So these are stronger poles, more space between wires, better equipment that doesn't spark. They're undergrounding. They're working to reduce the number of outages by breaking the system up into more pieces. We saw some of the benefits of this in March. So if you recall the March 14th public safety power shutoff, there were actually far fewer parts of town that were actually impacted, and this is because some of the work that Xcel has been doing. They're also improving their situational awareness. I think it's helpful to understand kind of how this affects Boulder, and like what the intersection is around wildfire safety, wildfire risk, and the experience we're having as a community. So I'm just going to walk through an example here in North Boulder. So the map here is showing it's the state's wildfire risk map. So obviously the darker the red, the higher the wildfire risk. You can see inside the urban boundary of North Boulder here that is relatively low risk. Again, because we're in the urban core, so there's less combustible materials, there's fire response, there's urban irrigation. But as I mentioned before, we have power lines that serve both inside and outside of the town. And so this area of town has been shut off in every one of the public safety power shutoff events, and I'll talk about why here in a second. So 2024, the two in December, and the March event. And it's because of this power line. It starts out in central Boulder, in the downtown area, runs up 28th Street, and then along the North Foothills Highway, along Highway 36 up towards Lyons. You'll recognize this line if you ever drive that highway. You'll see it sits right there along the wildlands. High vegetation along that. It's an older line, and that's a very high wind zone. So this is probably one of the highest risk lines we have in our area, which is where the concern stems from. And this is what it looks like from that map. The line actually forks off. Part of it feeds North Boulder. Part of it runs up Highway 36 towards Neva Road and feeds areas north of town. And then another part actually heads up Lee Hill Drive and feeds the foothills. And so it's actually the Lee Hill Drive area and the area north of town that's the wildfire risk, but because it's all connected to the line that serves North Boulder, this is why North Boulder has been shut off. The solution for this is Xcel is going to be undergrounding that line roughly 5.5 miles. And that project should start this year, so that North Boulder would not have to be subjected to the public safety power shutoffs anymore. And then they're hardening in the foothill area. As I mentioned, we're seeing more weather-related damage. There's a few reasons for this. In part, the way the wind patterns have been hitting our area, we're getting more tornado-like forces to the wind direction, so keep creating more shear that's causing more damage. We're having a lot more vegetation fail due to the extended droughts and disease, as well as the fact that we have a lot of mature and aging out vegetation in our area. And outages are lasting longer because of this, because there's not just the proactive shut off, but also images like the one in the lower corner here, which was taken during the December event. Both of these images were from December. We're also seeing failures on blue sky days, which exacerbates the problem for the community. They understand why power is getting shot, but they're attributing some of these other failures to the same thing, which is not true. We've actually seen equipment starting to fail in our substations. We've seen underground lines starting to fail, and this is just a function of the age. A lot of this equipment is put in at the time we grew. So Boulder had a large growth period in the 50s and then extending through the 70s and 80s. That's when a lot of our power infrastructure was put in place. It's just now aging out in its natural life cycle. And we happen to have a lot of it, and it's just not been proactively replaced, but there are plans to do so. So this led us to the council priority. Here's the work plan for this year. Again, this is a one-year priority, and the goal here is to build out a comprehensive understanding of what Xcel is planning to do to resolve these issues. So what investments are they planning to make? Where are the risks that are going to be remaining after they make those investments? Understanding what risks we face while they're making those investments that will, decline, but they're still present for many in our community. And then to use that to develop a set of prioritized policy opportunities that in future years council can take up and build additional projects around. So this is the scope of the project for this year. We do have plans to measure progress. This is an illustration of reliability metrics. Just to calibrate you in case you didn't get to read the memo in full. The one that's labeled SAIDI, this is a measure of how many minutes per year lines are out, and these are based on regions. So a low number is good, a high number is bad. And you can see in this ranking, the Boulder Division, which includes Boulder County, is by far the worst here on this map. So when you see Boulder Division, that's not just within the city limits, it's inclusive of areas like Nederland, Ward, some of our mountain areas that experience particularly poor reliability. We also measure frequency, like, even if you are experiencing long outages, you're experiencing repeated ones, that's a concern. The third one is what the average customer experiences, and we present this as both major event days and without major event days, where major event days is like the extreme events I showed you, or today's snowstorm would be an example of that. We also intend to measure progress in terms of investment, so how much Xcel is invested in the system, how many miles have been underground or rebuilt, how they're catching up on vegetation management, removing threatening trees, as well as trimming back so that there's more clearance on lines. So we have built in community engagement into this project for this year, again, to inform our understanding of risk and consequence of these outages to the community, as well as to inform the policy actions that future councils can take and elevate. So we want to certainly build a shared understanding of how this is impacting the community and really learn from communities on how to navigate this. We certainly see that many in our community are able to successfully navigate and even thrive still during these outages, while others really struggle. How can we learn from those who are more successful to build in better capacity and resilience for everybody? How do we can also prepare people for more outages? We're certainly seeing climate extremes grow. Even as we harden the system, there's opportunity to help people be more empowered and proactive. So how can we use this engagement to put more tools in the toolbox for all community members in the event that there are outages or disasters, so that we as a community are more resilient? And then refining the policies that council has cited as opportunities. We're particularly interested in planning to engage with frontline communities, neighborhoods who are most impacted by frequent extended outages. We, of course, know that from the data as well as from people we're hearing from. Particular focus on those who are disproportionately impacted by outage. So these would be people very dependent on electricity for things like medical or mobility needs, seniors who are more impacted also by outages, as well as our businesses and some of the losses they've experienced. So many of these groups we're generally planning on several types of engagement opportunities, from workshops to online surveys as our tools. We also see building in information and helping in empowerment. So we've stood up some web content. So we have a new project page, Power Reliability and Resilience. We did the town hall in January to try and get a little bit more of explanation out there so community can better understand what they were experiencing during these outages. We have a FAQ page that's been put together, and then more information about undergrounding electrical lines. People are very interested in that. So starting big with the window this summer, bringing that information down to a council community forum that will take place on October 8th. This is where we'll bring a select group of community members and council together in a study session format to really talk through some of the opportunities and priorities. And then the project doesn't end this year. We're just ending with kind of a roadmap of where future councils can go. And we would continue engagement around some of those policy actions into 2027 and beyond. Again, I said there's been progress. So I'll start, again, we've been at this for quite a while from an advocacy perspective, particularly after the 2024 public safety power shutoff. Staff were very active in Excel's filing of their 2027 through 2025 through 2027 wildfire mitigation plan at the Public Utilities Commission. We were able to get a lot accomplished there in terms of dedicated investment that will address many of the risks to the Boulder community and Boulder area. Similarly, we've been engaged on other plans outside of wildfire, such as rebuilding of our substations and expansion of power lines so that we can serve our growing needs in the community. Focusing on affordability and reliability in the rate case that's ongoing. We filed testimony last week on that topic, and then we're very actively engaged at the legislature this year on the reauthorization of the Public Utilities Commission, including advancing amendments around quality of service, improving penalties and staffing to ensure that the Public Utilities Commission is providing proper oversight to our utility. We've also now developed a preliminary map that takes all those spider web power lines I showed you previously and turns it into polygons of community areas. And so these different colors represent the subsets of the community that have the most similar experience in terms of reliability. And our plan is to basically create these as risk zones so we can better study, where there's disproportionate risk and disproportionate impact to really focus in some of our mitigations in the future. Council passed an update to our tax ordinance earlier this year, and this allows us to also provide a rebate back on taxes paid on batteries. We've seen a high adoption rate of battery backup systems, and also allows us to stand up a grant program that we hope to launch later this year to provide battery backup in support of resilience centers. Xcel is making progress too. They recently completed the Chautauqua undergrounding, the key phases that remove the power line from the open space areas and perimeter that were the greatest wildfire threat there. This not only reduces our wildfire risk, but also supports keeping power on in areas like University Hill, Upper Chautauqua. Lots of poles and wires replacement, as I'm sure many of our community have been experiencing. About to break ground on the first wildfire undergrounding project out in the county. I mentioned the Highway 36 project. There's also a lot of other reconstruction projects. I won't read all of them here. I will highlight though, and you'll be hearing from the city about this as well. We are expecting Xcel to really ramp up tree management within the Boulder area. We do have a lot of trees. It's been a while that they've trimmed certain areas, so there will be a large presence of their tree crews here over the course of this year. They've been working closely with our forestry team to get proper standards and identify best practices and best forestry practices. So more to come from this, but I just want to highlight that because you may be hearing from community once that starts, because it'll be pretty substantial compared to what people are used to. The policy options that we reviewed with council are advanced additional grid hardening and infrastructure investment. So just really seeking to better understand how we can influence and accelerate Excel's efforts through various strategies. Looking at the role of solar and storage locally to grow our local resilience. Community preparedness, as I mentioned a lot, is about how we capacity build within our own community so that we're ready for these outages, better able to respond. We've talked already about some of the regulatory and legislative pathways through our advocacy work at the state legislature and the Public Utilities Commission. There's potential for the city to increase our investment in our own infrastructure to enhance community resilience. And then obviously everything needs to be equity centered, but really thinking about resiliency strategies that are particularly targeted at some of our most at risk for outage. Finally, next steps. We'll provide council an update this summer with an information package, generally towards like the end of June as we're wrapping up that engagement window. We have the engagement window opening in June. Excel will be here to present to council on August 27th for a study session. And then I mentioned the community council forum on October 8th. So with that, I will stop sharing and take questions.
Thank you. I'll start off with just a quick one. You said they're starting this year that J Road 28th Street undergrounding. So how long would a project like that take?
It'll probably take about I guess I was going to answer a short version, and then basically these projects take about 2 years from concept to construction completion. They are wrapping up the final design now, and hopefully start construction around the third quarter, late summer. And then once construction starts, we would expect it to wrap up in early 2027 with final fixing landscaping and road repair kind of in that 2027 timeframe. The project out on 75th Street, which is by our wastewater treatment plant, is shorter, so it's just going from where our plant is up to Lookout Road. That'll start hopefully this month and would wrap up. There is kind of staged to work around the school session because the school's up there. But we would expect that one to be complete this year.
Okay, great.
I have a question just about like the how high risk area is determined. I think and should have written down the earlier slide where you had the dots of the frequency number of like outages, and I was trying to compare that slide analysis versus like the later ones that showed the different substation grids areas. And I think you highlighted the one that's like very intensely red, more central city. But I'm not sure if did that align with some of the like the example case. I think because those are different areas, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Oh, you're on mute.
Let me share it again. Hang on.
Right, because that's not the J Road area we're looking at currently, correct?
Yeah, so it's not. So this I highlighted this one. This is basically like the Aurora neighborhood. So here, the thing about this community is, sorry, I don't know why my slides are moving. I'll stop touching them. This section of town is actually fed by one of those power lines that serves outside the city. You would never know it based on where it is, but it's actually served from a power line that starts up by NCAR. So it passes overhead near the federal laboratories, and so it's been shut off for public safety power shutoffs. It's been tripped off because it's been in enhanced power safety modes. They've had one of those vehicle collisions, ran into equipment there along South Boulder Road that took them out. And then they've also been affected by some other failures of equipment. So it's the where we've seen the highest number of outages. The area with the longest duration outages is actually in North Boulder, right along Iris. Which is near North Boulder Rec Center, kind of that area, right around kind of either side of Iris, kind of Hawthorne, Broadway. And that's in part because of some substantial tree damage to power lines during the wind events. But like that ideal market area has been hard hit, so it kind of varies. North Boulder is reliable except for the wildfire outages, as an example, right? So they've been shut off, every public safety power shut off, but otherwise they haven't experienced outages. So that's kind of one of the, when I say there wasn't a silver bullet, each part of our community is being impacted for multiple reasons and different reasons. And so Xcel undergrounding that power line along Highway 36 there will give North Boulder probably very good reliability. Some of the solutions we have to dig deeper on for areas like the one I highlighted, like the Aurora neighborhood, because there's underground cable failures, there's other things that are impacting that. Shanahan Ridge is another area that was actually wildlife. The most common outage, we had rodents getting into underground equipment there repeatedly. Like, so they experienced in 2024, 2023 and 2024 many outages, right? So it's a combination of things. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you explaining that and all the different mechanisms of failure that are hard to address with one silver bullet, as you said. I kind of asked a question as well, leading to that second one, thinking about one of the section 6 of the equity centered resilience strategies focuses on prioritizing investments in communities with higher outage risk and lower adaptive capacity. And I'm trying to think through, as you're working through all these different failure modes and metrics that you have, it sounds like extensive data on, what are some of the methodologies being used to weight all those different metrics in order to identify highest priority areas to service in terms of making sure we're meeting that goal of higher outage risk, addressing higher outage risk first and lower adaptive capacity first. Is there a weighting function that's looking at each substation grouping, as you already highlighted in one of the other maps, towards also weighting towards say lower AMI, area medium income for those particular regions? How is that being prioritized in some of the assessment or final kind of imagine heat map you might be producing towards identifying where to prioritize first?
Yeah, and so I think sequencing. So the first thing is we're data gathering to have the information to understand where those disparate issues exist. So that's the kind of the map I showed with the different polygons, because we want to overlay at-risk populations within those as well as the outage data. Through the engagement process, I think we want to learn more about what some of the solutions are and where they're most effective before we assign a weighting. But by the end, that's the idea, is we would have a set of priorities that carry weight based on community engagement and the dialogue with council at the end of the year.
Thank you. I have one more question.
Sure.
Sure. So in the in a different line of thought, I'm thinking of what are the revenue streams that go towards funding some of these adaptations and infrastructure repairs. I'm kind of thinking in the context of if those revenue streams are primarily coming from taxes or if they're coming from Xcel, are the ways in which that revenue is being generated priced in such that they're calculating the lifetime amortized cost and replacement of those again, next future timing, next we need to replace them, and thinking about like, are we setting appropriate like taxation levels or XL fee levels, or encouraging setting of those fees such that, we're thinking through like, when we do underground a power line, that's going to last longer than an above ground line. And can we think through like that higher investment cost and legitimizing towards a certain, revenue generation structure that can, make sense of and like legitimize that higher expenditure that we might need to convince the community of for that maybe additional taxation or investment needed to perform these types of repairs. Like, is that included in the budgetary analysis and how these projects are priced out?
Yeah. So the Excel investment is all through their public utilities process and approved plan, and it's paid for by all ratepayers, all utility ratepayers. On that front, I think we want to make sure, to your point, that they're planning to recapitalize and replace, and so that we don't end up in the situation where we have a lot of aging out infrastructure failing all around the same time or presenting this risk. As far as where the city might lean in and provide additional investment, yeah, very much looking at cost versus benefit and understanding what the long-term need is going to be will be a very deep part of the conversation. For example, a lot of folks cite undergrounding as kind of, we'll hear from community a lot. We should underground everything. We should underground everything. Undergrounding solves for the wildfire risk. It definitely eliminates the wildfire risk. It's 4 to 10 times more expensive to construct underground. And as I mentioned, some of our largest and most impactful outages outside of public safety power shutoffs have actually been underground equipment failure. They're longer, they're harder to repair, they're harder to diagnose. So there's some trade-offs that we have to talk about. Similarly, in certain areas of town, undergrounding has a substantial financial impact on individual households. Because to move the lines underground, it often triggers upgrades. So that's a deep conversation we need to have with the community. We should maybe focus where we get the most benefit, and manage those costs. We have not identified a revenue stream, nor do we expect to kind of approve any of the strategies this year. The end is to be able to quantify what an estimated cost might look like and what the considerations are. And that then creates the roadmap that future councils will want to have that very conversation around what's the revenue source going to be? How do we present this to the community? So deeper conversations. Hopefully that answered it.
Yeah, I appreciate the response there.
I just have a question regarding environmental studies that are being conducted with the disturbed area. Specifically wondering about any obstructions to groundwater flow, any heat that's generated from these electric lines and how that could affect surrounding soils and vegetation. And then what Excel is planning to do with regard to restoring disturbed vegetation to ensure that we're minimizing invasive species.
Yes. That is an amazing question. So I appreciate you. And I'm just reflecting on the journey we've been on a couple of projects. So certainly whenever they're extensively engaged with our open space department, because there are some projects that traverse our open space lands. Right now there is a repair going on that's up Sunshine Canyon and on our open space. And so, that went through review with the open space board and complies with our standards for, considerations around different vegetation. So we've definitely been heavily engaged in that. It's not my area of expertise, but we work closely with our open space team to review those. The larger projects that I talk about are all going to be within the roadway. So the right-of-way, roadway kind of areas where we mitigate some of those disturbances. But, we had there's the 75th Street project hasn't started yet because we're monitoring, or Excel is monitoring I want to say there's a couple of owl species that are concerned in that area. So it's certainly looking at that. And then they're required to remediate to our standards, wherever it's our public right of way. And that's where most of the work is taking place. It is certainly a concern though. And certainly as they're going up into, but they aren't underground. So most of the undergrounding is happening just proximate to town. They don't underground like up in the mountains. You asked about thermal loading and water plane disruption. That's certainly all evaluated. I mean, it goes through the permit process. They're not necessarily generating a lot of heat, is my understanding, but they're I'd have to double check and understand a little bit more of that. But certainly those are things that are looked at in the permit process.
Okay, thank you.
You made me think of an, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. You made me think of an additional question, as you mentioned, like a lot of projects we be considering along already right of ways and like roadways. In that context, is there like a plan or policy already set in the sense to whenever a road is dug up and replaced for like asphalt or transportation reasons? Is there intention or plan to like at that time when it's cheaper to like add an underground kind of like conduit line for like maybe future interconnection of like larger networks of like underground lines? So I think, for example, on the upcoming like Iris Avenue improvement project, if that would be like a potential consideration to like two birds with one stone in a sense, attack that problem and also upgrade some of the potential underground utility infrastructure that could be added there.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think I'll take that as a recommendation. We've certainly looked at that. We can direct some of Excel's undergrounding. So that was the very conversation we had on North Broadway as an example, which was the first undergrounding project that was done once we went back under franchise with Excel. And for that very reason is we're getting ready to redo that whole part of North Broadway and concrete, and we don't want to come back and later disturb it. So we certainly look at that, but I don't know that we've looked at the idea of extra conduit, and I'd have to have that conversation with our transportation team to see if they've explored that with Excel, but I think it's a good recommendation.
Thank you.
Annie?
Yeah, thank you. I have like a couple of questions. So the first one, about how much will all this cost Excel? And do you know what percentage of the revenues they get from the payers in Boulder County or City of Boulder County will that be?
Yeah. So their wildfire mitigation plan, so the 2025 through 2027 plan, they were approved for roughly $1.9 billion of investment. We don't know the exact number of what that's going to represent in the Boulder area, but I would anticipate it's several hundred million of that, because a lot of the work is in the areas surrounding Boulder. All of that is ratepayer funded. So all ratepayers is distributed across all Colorado utility payers.
Okay. And then does the City of Boulder have any tools to hold Excel accountable? You talked about the lived experience, from lived experience, having been through a couple of PSPSs, it seems there's a lot of incompetence on the part of Excel in not providing services to the ratepayers, right? What other tools does the city have to hold them accountable?
Yeah, so as you understand, we don't regulate Excel, so we
Yeah.
have very limited authority. This is why a lot of our advocacy at the Public Utilities Commission has been particularly important. So that's certainly a priority one is we raise those issues. We certainly work through our partnership to the extent that we can. And then we're, having conversations with our legislators as well about solutions, but those are kind of the avenues that are available to us.
Okay. And then final question, I think you did mention backup options for batteries. I understand that the city does not give out permits anymore for generators. Is that true?
So slightly true. It's not anymore. We've had in place, like most urban communities, noise restrictions in our residential zoned areas. Generators are not made that meet those decibel thresholds within our residential areas. So technically, residential generators have not been allowed for decades. The added layer is that with the energy code, that's an added enforcement mechanism to keep them from being installed outside of the noise ordinance. They are still allowed for in non-residential zones for like multifamily buildings, commercial buildings, where hospitals, senior homes, just not for residential.
So,
And I also will take this moment just to say, I understand people have a very acute experience of late with unreliable power. This is not our future, and this is not an acceptable state. The solution is not having everybody who can afford to go out and spend $15,000, $20,000 installing a gas backup.
yeah.
That in most cases, like people aren't maintaining them, they weren't reliable anyway. Like that's not the solution. So we definitely don't want that. We support batteries because they provide benefits beyond backup that support our overall resilience of our grid. They save people money because you use them to do arbitrage on your utility costs. Like they provide value. So if people are going to make an investment, we'd like to see it be one that they actually benefit from. So that's why we haven't taken up this topic of generators and do we want to change noise thresholds in residential areas? Like it just shouldn't be that way. And we're not unique. Like this is not unique to Boulder. But yeah, that's the solution. And then we're also, I think one of our goals is to provide more resources for people to understand what tools are available. Like you can have a portable generator or a temporary generator. Like if people are that concerned, that is allowable. It's a solution. There's solutions for smaller equipment. Several people have gotten things like one of the brands is like Jackery with a little solar panel, right? So there's more accessible solutions, but from a city perspective, we just need to solve the problem. We should experience good reliability, few outages, and when there are outages, they should be relatively short in duration. They shouldn't be the kind of thing that creates such a threat on public health and well-being.
The battery storage systems, they're exorbitantly expensive, right?
It turns out that from what we're seeing in terms of quotes, they're no different than a backup generator or potentially less when you take into account incentives that you can get from Xcel and others. So the prices have been coming down, and especially for residential, they actually have a payback in terms of, I mean, it's not like 3 years, but I'm not advocating people go out and get batteries either for all the reasons I just said.
Yeah, makes sense.
But we'll certainly do our best to support those that want to make that step. But I think there has to be other solutions that are more accessible for more people.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I have a question, Carolyn. Thanks for the overview. For a lot of these initiatives that Excel is pursuing. I'm curious to know if those came from Excel themselves. Do they come from the Utility Commission? Do they come from the city of Boulder? Do they come from the community? Just curious to know where some of these suggestions on what to do to address these problems originate from.
Yeah, that's a really great question. You know, our California utilities, you know, got there first about a decade ago when they started, you know, with things like the Camp Fire occurred. And so they've been trying to figure out, you know, how to do some of these solutions like sectionalizing, rebuilding, wildfire standards. So a lot of this stems from Excel with lessons learned from the industry and best practices that have come out of utilities like PG&E and Southern Cal Edison from some of their learnings and experiences. So a lot of like the wildfire hardening solutions and rebuilds are really coming from Excel. How it gets implemented in Boulder, though, is benefiting from our internal expertise. So, you know, through years of pursuing municipalization, we developed a pretty deep understanding of the utility grid that serves us. So we're able to work hand in hand with the Excel engineers and say, you know, here's the problem here, and here's how we can best solve for it based on what we know about the community. So there's some complementary design going on with our electrical engineer and theirs. So that's helpful. As far as like the rest of the policy actions, I mean, these are things that I think we've been hearing from the community and others. At the Public Utilities Commission, there's also ideas and solutions that come from other parties that may participate in that. But you know, I want to credit Excel. A lot of this is their initiative. I mean, they got us here in the first place. Like, this is an under-maintained system and it's aged and the risk is real and it's there, but they're taking steps to correct it. And they don't like shutting power off to a community. That's not the thing they want to be doing, and they want to fix it really quickly. And I think we're going to be seeing, and we already have seen some changes pretty quickly. You know, I expect most people inside the city limits will not be subjected to future PSPSs after maybe 2027. And I think maybe even this year. I mean, I think that they're going to decrease who they have to shut off or how long they're going to have to shut off very quickly for that reason. So I do want to give them credit for that.
My next question was, are there certain requests or interventions that Excel is resisting, and how would you overcome that? But it sounds like from your response that if Excel is kind of the originator of a lot of these ideas based on industry best practices, it sounds like they are willing to, you know, move forward with them to address the problems, and don't need, there doesn't need to be as much of an alternative argument to try and convince them that this really needs to be done to meet the needs of the community.
Yeah, I think where I would put that category a little bit is, you know, I think there's a tension on the undergrounding solution. It's not their preference to underground as a standard practice. As I mentioned, it's more expensive. It's leads to longer outages when it fails. So they're certainly undertaking undergrounding from the perspective of wildfire risk reduction, but not necessarily to address the other sources of damage we're seeing. So I think that's why I said like some of the weather related damage. You know, I looked at the outage map today. Large swaths of South Boulder were without power. Parts of North and Northeast Boulder were without power, and that's trees coming down on overhead power lines. Excel isn't going to want to underground those for all the reasons I said. So I think if, as a community, if we want to pursue that, that's probably something we're going to have to push on.
Can I, from what I've read, it seems like the communities where there's significant undergrounding have fewer outages, which seems contrary to some of the things that you're saying, which I believe Excel is saying, right?
Yeah, fewer outages. It's definitely overall more reliable. It's more expensive. So I think everybody agrees it's more expensive. It's when a outage occurs, the impact can be larger. Now there's ways to mitigate it. I showed you the chart with the outage data, and the lowest numbers are Fort Collins and Longmont. And then I don't think we have Loveland data, but Fort Collins and Longmont both report to the data source we had. And the majority of their system is underground. I think Fort Collins is almost 100%, not a full 100%, and Longmont's something, above 80% underground. Boulder's actually high. I mean, I think we're 71%. But like I said, their preference, like they prefer overhead construction because it's cheaper and it's easier to make quick repairs and get power back on quickly. That's just their preference. But you don't have cars running into power lines. You don't have trees falling down. You don't have to keep after tree trimming. So there are things that lead to better reliability for underground systems overall.
Yeah, so for the community, we would prefer to have an underground system, right? So, okay, fair.
I had a follow-up question on the earlier point about the grants available for battery installations. I'm thinking about additional kind of investments you said that would also serve other long-term needs. And I'm thinking to the recent passing of the state bill for balcony solar and how that could be also tied in and also be an option to enable renters to be able to have access to that sort of grant funding. And I think even to the initial battery grant availability, is that only for permanent battery installs? Or does that also cover portable Jackery type ones you mentioned earlier? And would there be opportunity to even expand or at least educate the public about that future offering where balcony solar options are also allowed? Because I recall in last PSPSs, I actually used a electric motorbike battery I had to power my fridge during the outage. And that lasted during that period of time, but not everyone has that extra battery lying around. There's lots of that being purchased, I think, for some folks, even though some of those bikes are illegal, and there needs to be also education on that context as well. But there's at least a multi-use there, and how can we be creative in thinking about those additional multi-uses, whether it's balcony solar or maybe e-bike batteries or vehicle to grid charging methodologies for electric vehicles, and how we can incentivize any or all three of those programs under that similar kind of battery program you already mentioned. Is that considered in future expansions or additional considerations on that program?
Yeah, thank you. I'm admiring Annie's dog. Our extra board member. So there's a lot to unpack there. Initially, I think we're looking at kind of solutions that serve broader groups of community members. So thinking about if there's schools or shared spaces in high density housing areas or something that can provide resources. We don't have a lot of money, just for clarity. We have a little bit of money. As far as the balcony solar, kind of one of the nuances of the legislation is those won't provide you enough power to power your home once the grid goes offline. The UL certification is going to require them to disconnect, just as systems do today. So I think we're going to have to learn a little bit more about where the opportunity is there. I think we're focusing on education around some of the other tools like the smaller batteries, but not necessarily providing grants at this time to portable. I think we want to learn from community through the engagement process what more solutions are necessary, but we definitely do see at least an opportunity for some strategically located spaces where we have nonprofits who have put solar in and can add a battery relatively easily and become a center where people can go during an outage and get internet access and those types of things. Understanding that doesn't solve for a lot of people. Not everybody's in a position to be able to go anywhere. we need to have a long game that looks at that broader topics of how we help everybody be most successful. Certainly, vehicle to grid, batteries, educating about like if you have an electric vehicle, how you can use it to back up your fridge, teaching people, about having coolers on hand and being able to refresh ice or things like that. I mean, there's even low dollar solutions that a lot of folks don't even think about or aren't prepared. Like a first step for us is just having everybody have an outage plan, like know what you do when you make decisions on if you leave. I think getting everybody prepared is the first step, but we have a very finite set of financial resources, so we can't solve kind of broad community at this point. I think that's the topic though for the one of the priorities I think I had on that list, more distributed resources. I think that's what we want to hear from the community and talk with council about through this process.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think I want to highlight one idea at least you brought to mind when you mentioned like kind of community centers, people where people could go to and get support, and maybe think of like it would be a really cool, interesting idea for like folks that would be in need of to be able to like lease out like a portable battery system to like just power their fridge. So I think that's like one of the most critical things I think people can get by with during an outage. But like, obviously like heat and other kind of like those sort of systems are maybe more important depending on the time of year an outage happens. But like yeah, like that would be an interesting idea to think about as well in terms of a community centralized hubs where people can get resources and what could be made portable, even leased out for during those PSPS periods.
Thank you.
You're gonna teach me the e-bike thing though.
Oh yeah, no, there's an inverter thing. It's really easy actually, but yeah.
Cool. Didn't know that.
Yeah, for me, the biggest issue is the heat, like when it happens in the winters, it's, get a Yeti cooler, put some ice, your food is fine, it's just heating up the house.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think understanding like when you need to know how to shut off your water and go somewhere.
Yep, yep.
And yeah, knowing when your threshold is of when you make that decision. We've certainly talked to some folks after the December event who, because of the very bad information, I think somebody mentioned this, right? You probably did, Annie, like the there wasn't clarity like how long the outage was, what the restoration status, like there was a lot of issues with the communication, which we've shared with the commission, a lot of recommendations around that. But they stayed in their home for a long time and like suffered physical and mental distress that could have, and ultimately had to like leave, but it like took a really long time to recover. And so information's power, and getting better resources I think is important. And yeah, Excel definitely needs to fix their communications.
Think of like a creative solutions to that space of like like Trombe wall, like passive heating systems that like take advantage of like solar heating, and how do we encourage that as like a supplemental, like non-HVAC required kind of heating system that can also lower your general heating bill outside of like power shut off periods or instability in the grid. And I'm not sure the ways in which like systems like that are even like permitted and like permitting design and code of the city.
What's it called?
It's a Trombe wall. It's a TROMBE. It collects heat from the sun, and then like there's a way in the way in which it designs it circulates that through the house. It can help reduce the energy load consumed by most buildings. But there's I think the tendency of most architectural design today is focusing on HVAC type systems, but how can we think of like types of systems that can supplement that, but then also not rely on power to operate?
Yeah, we tend to incentivize in code use of passive designs, make it easier to comply with code if you incorporate those types of designs, or if you have like a passive home certification, it's easier to comply. But we don't require it. But I agree with you. We don't see a substantial uptake in it. There's definitely opportunity. And it definitely is the gift that keeps on giving, as you noted.
Any more questions? Thank you so much. That was really informative and
Thank you. We'll definitely be back with more conversations as the year progresses, and I'm happy to come back, and good to see everybody.
yeah,
Thank you.
hope you feel better.
Thank you. I'm gonna pass it back to you, Heather, so I can go.
Sure, thanks.
Thank you.
Do we need to do anything?
There aren't any public hearing items or old business updates. I know Jonathan usually likes to go through the council calendar preview. So I'll just highlight on there that there is on July 30th, there is a wildfire resilience study session. Where council and staff will discuss home hardening implementation hub and assessment of current programs, projects, and actions. So tune into that if you're interested. And then that full council agenda committee summary is in your packet. So if you see anything that interests you and you want to learn more about, just reach out and let me know, and I'll see what I can find for you.
Thank you.
Mhm. And your next meeting is scheduled for June 3rd at 6 p.m. And that's the end of the agenda.
All right, motion to adjourn. Perfect.
Is that right, people say?
That's perfect.
Nailed it.
Well, bye, Amy.
Bye, thank you.
You, Doug.
Sure.